September 23rd, 1944. Belgian Ardennes Forest, 6 kilometers east of the German border. Corporal Michael Chun crouches in the pre-dawn darkness, his hands working through cold mud and rusted wires salvaged from a collapsed fence line 3 days ago. Around him, the forest breathes with the subtle sounds of nocturnal creatures returning to their dens, oblivious to the war that has turned these woods into a chessboard where every move carries lethal consequences. Chen's patrol, 12 men from the 28th Infantry Division's Reconnaissance Company, has been operating behind German lines for 8 days, gathering intelligence on enemy troop movements as Allied forces prepare for their final push into Germany. Their orders are explicit: observe, report, avoid contact. But Chun is building something that violates the spirit, if not the letter of those orders, a contraption so unorthodox that when he first proposed it 3 nights ago, his sergeant laughed until he realized Chun was serious, then ordered him to forget the stupid idea and focus on the mission. Chun didn't forget. He couldn't, because the idea had taken root in his mind with the clarity of absolute certainty, the kind of insight that feels less like invention and more like remembering something obvious that everyone else somehow missed. Now, working by touch in darkness thick enough to hide his movements from the German observation post 800 meters to the east, Chun threads rusted wire through a pattern of stakes and tension points that looks like random debris, but is actually a precisely calculated trap designed to do something the Army doesn't have proper equipment for: capture enemy soldiers alive without firing a shot. In 6 hours, that trap is going to prove either brilliantly effective or catastrophically stupid, and she will either be court-martialed for disobeying orders or become the accidental inventor of a fieldcraft technique that will be taught to reconnaissance units for the next 30 years. Chun didn't grow up preparing for military innovation. Born in San Francisco's Chinatown in 1921, he was the son of immigrants who ran a small import business. His childhood split between helping in the family warehouse and attending public schools where being Chinese meant fighting twice as hard for half the recognition. His teacher saw a quiet kid who preferred mechanical puzzles to social interaction, who could disassemble and reassemble anything with moving parts, who understood structural engineering intuitively the way some kids understand music. By 15, Chin was helping his father jury-rig warehouse equipment, building improvised lifting systems and pulley arrangements that moved heavy cargo with minimal effort, solutions that relied on leverage and geometry rather than brute force. His father called it practical thinking. His mother worried he spent too much time alone with wire and would instead of building friendships. Neither understood that Chen's mind worked through physical problems the way other people work through conversations, finding satisfaction in the elegant efficiency of a well-designed mechanical system. When Pearl Harbor brought war to America's doorstep, Chen enlisted immediately, partly from patriotism, partly to prove his loyalty in a climate increasingly hostile to Japanese Americans, and by extension anyone who looked vaguely Asian. The Army assigned him to infantry, not because they recognized any special aptitude, but because that's where they put most recruits who didn't qualify for specialized technical roles. Basic training came easy for Chun in the physical sense, his warehouse work having built practical strength, but the tactical instruction frustrated him with its rigid doctrine and formulaic approaches to problems that seemed to demand creative solutions. They taught you to assault positions with overwhelming firepower, to defend by establishing interlocking field of fire, to patrol by following specific formations and procedures. Everything was standardized, documented, drilled until it became automatic, which Chin understood intellectually, but found limiting, because real problems rarely match textbook scenarios. His instructors marked him as competent but unimaginative, a soldier who followed orders adequately without showing initiative or leadership potential, exactly the kind of anonymous infantryman who would serve his time and return civilian life without leaving any mark on military history. They were half right about the anonymous part. Chen's unit, Company B of the 28th Infantry Division's 112th Regiment, shipped to England in October 1943, spent 7 months training for the invasion of Europe, and hit Normandy beaches on D-Day +10 June 16, 1944. The next 3 months taught Chin the difference between training and combat, lessons written in mud and blood, and the terrible mathematics of attrition warfare. He learned that tactical doctrine worked beautifully when your side had material superiority, but became desperately improvised when you didn't. He learned that fire superiority meant burning through ammunition faster than supply lines could replace it. He learned that casualties weren't abstractions and reports, but specific faces, specific voices that suddenly went silent, and that war consumed men at rates that made individual survival feel more like luck than skill. By September, Chen's original company had been reinforced twice, most of the Normandy veterans either dead or evacuated for wounds. The unit, now a mix of combat-tested survivors and fresh replacements, tried to learn fast enough to stay alive. Chen had become one of the quiet professionals, soldiers who moved through combat zones with practice efficiency, who understood terrain instinctively, who could read a tactical situation fast enough to make decisions that kept people alive. His sergeant, a Texas oil worker named Morrison who'd survived since North Africa, noticed Chen's situational awareness and tapped him for reconnaissance work. Small patrols that pushed ahead of the main advance to identify enemy positions and report back. It was dangerous work with high casualty rates, but Morrison figured Chen's careful, methodical approach gave him better survival odds than the aggressive types who took unnecessary risks. For 6 weeks, Chen ran patrols through French and Belgian countryside, learning the craft of moving invisibly through hostile territory, reading landscape for concealment and approach routes, developing an intuition for where enemies would position themselves based on natural defensive advantages. He got good at it. Good enough that Morrison trusted him to lead his own patrols. Good enough that he started seeing patterns in enemy behavior that most soldiers never noticed because they were too focused on immediate tactical concerns to step back and analyze underlying logic. The idea that would become his Russ wire trap emerged from observing a specific problem that reconnaissance patrols faced but had no good solution for. Intelligence wanted prisoners, enemy soldiers who could be interrogated for information about troop strengths, defensive positions, planned movements. Capturing prisoners during regular combat was relatively straightforward because you had overwhelming force to compel surrender, but reconnaissance patrols operated with small numbers in enemy territory, circumstances where attempting to capture anyone meant risking the entire patrol. Standard procedure when encountering enemy soldiers was to avoid contact if possible, or, if contact was unavoidable, to engage with maximum violence and withdraw before reinforcement arrived. This meant reconnaissance units rarely captured prisoners, and when they did, it was almost accidental, happening across isolated sentries who could be overwhelmed before they raised alarm. Intelligence complained constantly about the lack of prisoners, but no one had figured out a practical method for small patrols to capture enemy soldiers without the firefights that compromised their concealment. Chen started thinking about the problem after his patrol spent 6 hours lying motionless while a German supply detail moved through their position, for soldiers close enough to touch but impossible to capture without gunfire that would alert the entire German line. Morrison had made the right tactical decision, letting them pass to preserve the patrol's safety, but Chen couldn't stop calculating the missed opportunity for prisoners with detailed knowledge of supply routes and unit deployments walking away because the patrol had no means of taking them without combat. That night, hiding in a forest depression 3 kilometers behind German lines, Chen sketched in his notebook while the rest of the patrol slept, working through the geometry of a problem that felt similar to the mechanical puzzles he'd solved in his father's warehouse. You needed to restrain multiple people simultaneously, without noise, using materials available in the field, in a way that allowed a small force to maintain control. The obvious solutions all failed practical constraints. Nets required bulk and setup time. Pits were impractical in most terrain and require extensive digging. Tripwires connected to alarms or weapons gave warning, but didn't capture anyone. What Chen needed was something that would physically restrain targets while simultaneously creating confusion and disorientation, buying precious seconds for a small team to establish control before anyone could shout or fire weapons. The answer came from remembering wire entanglements he'd seen in defensive positions, not the heavy barrier wire used to stop vehicles, but lighter agricultural fencing that caught and snagged rather than blocking outright. German positions often included salvage farm fencing, rusty wire left over from the region's agricultural past, considered useless by military engineers because it lacked the strength for proper defensive barriers but too much effort to remove, so it just accumulated in piles behind the lines. Chen started collecting rust wire during patrols, stuffing sections into his pack, while other soldiers looked at him like he'd lost his mind, hoarding worthless corroded metal that added weight for no apparent purpose. Morrison asked what he was doing with the junk wire, and Chen explained he had an idea for a prisoner trap, which earned him another skeptical look, but Morrison didn't order him to dump it, so Chin kept collecting. The concept crystallized over several nights of refinement. A design that used rust wire-specific properties, its tendency to snag on fabric and equipment, its near invisibility in low light, its silence compared to newer wire that pinged and resonated when disturbed. Chen's trap would create a three-dimensional web at ankle and knee height, anchored to trees and stakes in a pattern that looked random, but was actually calculated to force anyone walking through it into specific movements. The wire wouldn't be strong enough to hold anyone by brute force, but it didn't need to be, because Chin understood that restraint is psychological as much as physical. Someone suddenly tangled in wire and darkness would instinctively try to free themselves, which would cause more entanglement, which would create panic, and panic would make them clumsy and noisy and distracted precisely when they needed to be calm and alert. A small team positioned around the trap could move in during those critical seconds of confusion, overwhelming targets before they understood what was happening, using the trap's disorientation to multiply force effectiveness. It was brilliant in theory, completely unproven in practice, and absolutely not something covered in any field manual Chin had ever seen. When he finally worked up the courage to propose it formally, during a patrol briefing 3 nights ago, Morrison's initial reaction was dismissive laughter. The sergeant listened to Chen's explanation with visible skepticism, asking pointed questions about how exactly you control 11 tangled, panicking soldiers with 4-man patrol. What happened if they started shooting despite being tangled? How you prevented the whole thing from turning into a cluster mess that got everyone killed. Chen walked him through the geometry, explaining sight lines and approach angles and the specific placement of team members to create overlapping fields of control. He showed the calculations for wire tension and anchor points, demonstrated how the pattern would force targets into predictable movements, explained the psychological dynamics of sudden entanglement, and how you exploited those seconds of confusion. Morrison listened, and Chin could see him mentally running through scenarios, testing the concept against his combat experience. Finally, the sergeant said it was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard. It violated basic tactical principles about maintaining mobility and fire superiority, and intelligence would probably laugh them out of the briefing room if they suggested capturing 11 Germans with rusty wire and optimism. Then he paused and added that it was also just crazy enough that it might work exactly once before the Germans figured it out, and intelligence had been riding them hard about prisoner captures. So if Chin wanted to waste his personal time building his ridiculous trap on the slim chance they encountered a perfect scenario to use it, Morrison wouldn't stop him but wouldn't authorize it either, meaning if it went wrong, Chun would take full responsibility. It was a grudging permission of a leader who thought the idea was stupid, but respected his subordinate enough to let him try. Over the next 3 nights, while officially observing German positions, Chin scouted locations where his trap might be effectively deployed, looking for specific terrain features, narrow approaches flanked by heavy vegetation, routes that German patrols use regularly, positions where his team could establish concealment within 10 meters of the trap perimeter. He found the perfect spot on the second night of searching, a forest trail that connected 2 German positions, narrow enough to force single-file or double-file movement, with dense undergrowth providing concealment, far enough from main German lines that reinforcements would take minutes to respond to any disturbance. Chin spent an entire day observing the trail from a high position 200 meters away, timing German movements, counting patrol sizes, noting patterns in their security procedures. What he discovered made his pulse quicken with possibility. Every 6 hours, a German squad moved along this trail, 11 soldiers conducting what appeared to be routine patrol rotation between positions. They moved with the casual alertness of troops in their own territory, weapons slung or held loosely, talking in low voices, not expecting contact because they were well behind their own defensive lines. They were perfect targets for his trap if, and it was a massive if, he could get authorization to try it. Morrison's response when Chin briefed the opportunity was a long silence, followed by a string of creative profanity that questioned Chen's intelligence, sanity, and understanding of what reconnaissance meant. The sergeant pointed out, with increasing volume, that their orders were to observe and report, not to conduct unauthorized combat operations behind enemy lines, that attempting to capture 11 Germans with 4-man patrol was suicide regardless of what kind of clever trap you built. That failure would mean either death or capture and interrogation that would compromise their entire intelligence operation, and that even success would alert the Germans to patrol presence in this sector and trigger a massive search that would make extraction nearly impossible. Everything Morrison said was tactically sound and completely correct, and Chun had no counterargument except that they could capture 11 Germans alive, deliver more prisoners in one operation than the entire division had taken in 2 weeks, and provide intelligence with information that might save dozens of American lives when the offensive resumed. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then made a decision that would define both their careers. He would send a coded message to battalion intelligence describing the opportunity and Chen's proposed method, and he would let them decide whether the potential intelligence gain justified the tactical risk. If intelligence approved, they would attempt the capture. If intelligence said no, the subject was closed and Chen would forget his wire trap fantasy and get back to actual reconnaissance work. The message went out that night, and the response came back 6 hours later with surprising speed. Proceed with capture attempt, priority alpha, all available support authorized. Detailed prisoner interrogation required for upcoming operations planning. Good hunting. Chen spent the remaining hours before dawn on September 23rd installing his trap with the meticulous care of someone who understood that every stake placement and wire tension adjustment was a difference between success and catastrophic failure. The design used 40 meters of salvaged rust wire, aged perfectly to near invisibility in forest darkness, threaded through a pattern of stakes and anchor points that created 3 overlapping zones. The outer zone, waist-high wire strung loose between trees, was designed to catch equipment and slow targets without alerting them to serious entanglement. The middle zone, knee-high with multiple crossing strands, would hit as targets instinctively moved forward, creating the first serious restraint. The inner zone, ankle-level wire anchored to ground stakes, would catch feet as targets tried to back away from the entanglement, completing the trap by making any movement in any direction produce more snaring. The entire pattern covered a 12-meter section of trail, long enough that a squad in column formation would have multiple soldiers in each zone when the trap triggered, distributing the entanglement across the formation, so no one could assist others without becoming entangled themselves. Chun positioned his 3 teammates in concealed positions surrounding the trap, each assigned specific targets and backup contingencies, everyone equipped with improvised gags and restraints Chun had fabricated from spare equipment. The plan was timed seconds. When the trap triggered and targets began entangling, the team would have approximately 4 seconds while confusion peaked. They would move in simultaneously from different angles, creating the impression of overwhelming force. They would secure the nearest targets first using surprise and aggression to establish psychological dominance. And they would work outward through the entangled formation before anyone recovered enough to organize resistance. It was a plan with approximately 1,000 ways to fail catastrophically, and maybe one narrow pathway to success. And as Shin settled into his high position 15 meters from the trap center, he felt the weight of responsibility mixing with anticipation, so intense it was almost nausea. At 0534 hours, with dawn still 40 minutes away, Chun heard movement approaching from the east, the soft sounds of boots on forest trail, and low German voices carrying through morning mist. His heart rate spiked, then settled into the focused calm he'd learned in combat. Fear transformed into heightened awareness that made time feel elastic. 11 German soldiers materialized from the darkness, moving in loose column formation exactly as Chin had observed during surveillance, their weapons slung casually, their attention focused more on footing in the dim light than on tactical security. The lead soldier was 3 meters from the outer wire zone when Chin gave the signal, a soft click that alerted his team to prepare for action. Then the Germans walked into his trap. The effect was almost exactly as Chun had calculated, with one crucial difference. It worked faster and more comprehensively than he dared hope. The lead soldier hit the outer waist-high wire first, felt it catch his equipment belt, and instinctively reached down to clear what he thought was a branch or debris. This pulled him slightly forward and off balance, which meant when his next step landed, he had more weight on his lead foot than normal, and that foot caught the knee-high crossing strands perfectly. He stumbled, tried to recover balance, which pulled 2 other soldiers into the outer zone as the column compressed. Within 2 seconds, 6 Germans were entangled to varying degrees, their instinctive movements to free themselves causing exactly the cascading snaring Chun had designed for. The reaction was everything Chin needed: confusion, disorientation. Soldiers focused on their immediate physical predicament rather than tactical awareness, weapons still slung because no one understood they were under attack. Chen and his team moved with choreographed precision, emerging from concealment as silent shadows that became physical force before the Germans realized anything beyond accidental entanglement was happening. Chen hit his primary target, the squad leader identifiable by position and equipment, driving the man to ground and applying a gag before he could shout, using wire tension to his advantage by pulling against the snaring, so the target's own struggles increased restraint. To his left, Morrison was taking down two soldiers simultaneously, using their entanglement to prevent mutual support, his movements economic and brutal in their efficiency. The other two team members secured their assignments with similar speed, and suddenly 5 Germans were restrained and gagged, while 6 others were still trying to understand what was happening to the darkness and wire and complete surprise of the assault. The next 15 seconds would determine success or catastrophic failure, because those remaining 6 soldiers were starting to process that they were under attack. Hands were moving toward weapons. Mouths were opening to shout. Chen made a decision that military psychologists would later study as textbook exploitation of cognitive dissonance. He shouted in German, a phrase he'd memorized phonetically, telling them they were surrounded by superior force and resistance would be met with immediate lethal response. The shout came from darkness, from an unexpected direction, delivered with absolute authority, and it hit the already disoriented soldiers like a hammer. 3 of them froze, hands still reaching for weapons but not completing the movement, brains locked in decision paralysis between fight and surrender. 2 others actually raised their hands, the conditioning of military discipline responding to authoritative commands, even when those commands came from the enemy. Only 1 soldier, younger than the others and perhaps less disciplined or perhaps braver, managed to unsling his rifle and begin bringing it to bear on Morrison's position. Chen saw the movement in his peripheral vision, saw the rifle coming up, understood he had perhaps 1 second before the situation exploded into a firefight that would kill soldiers on both sides and collapse his carefully orchestrated capture into exactly the kind of chaotic engagement Morrison had warned about. He didn't think, just reacted, throwing himself sideways across 3 meters of wire-tangled ground, accepting the cuts and snaring as he collided with the German soldier at knee level. The impact folded the man backward, his rifle discharging skyward with a crack that shattered forest silence and would absolutely alert every German position within a kilometer. Chen grappled for control of the weapon, got his hand on the barrel, twisted away while simultaneously driving his knee into the soldier's solar plexus hard enough to paralyze the diaphragm and prevent shouting. The German went limp, gasping for breath that wouldn't come, and Chen stripped the rifle away while Morrison appeared from nowhere to apply restraints. The entire engagement, from first contact to final restraint, had lasted 38 seconds. 11 German soldiers were now prisoners, 9 secure without injury, 2 with minor wounds from aggressive takedown techniques, all of them alive and available for interrogation, captured by 4 American soldiers using Russ wire and unconventional tactics that no military manual described. Morrison was already on the radio, transmitting their success code and requesting immediate extraction, because that rifle shot had started a clock. They probably had 10 minutes before German reaction forces converged on this position, and they needed to move these prisoners 3 kilometers through hostile territory to reach friendly lines. What followed was a controlled chaos of rapid movement. Prisoners secured in a column with individual restraints that allowed walking but prevented running. The patrol team spread around them, providing security, while maintaining pace that was just shy of running. Chen kept expecting German pursuers, kept listening for the sound of organized search parties, but the forest remained quiet except for their own movement. Later analysis would suggest the Germans initially dismissed a single rifle shot as an accidental discharge, common enough in rear areas where bored soldiers mishandle weapons, giving the patrol precious minutes to distance themselves from the capture site before the missing squad was reported and search operations began. They crossed back into American lines at 0647 hours, emerging from forest to find themselves facing very surprised forward positions who'd received radio warning to expect friendly patrol with multiple prisoners, but hadn't quite believed the message until Chen's team appeared with 11 Germans in tow. The prisoners were immediately hustled to battalion intelligence for interrogation, while Morrison filed his after-action report. And Chen found himself sitting in a command post bunker, trying to explain his Russ wire trap to a succession of increasingly senior officers who wanted to understand exactly how 4 soldiers had captured 11 enemy combatants without firing a shot and with 0 friendly casualties. The intelligence value of those prisoners exceeded anyone's expectations. Under interrogation, the German squad leader revealed detailed information about defensive positions, troop strengths, supply routes, and upcoming unit rotations that intelligence called the most comprehensive tactical picture they'd obtained in months. 2 of the soldiers were technical specialists who provided information about communication networks and artillery positions. The entire intelligence windfall directly contributed to planning for the next phase of Allied advance, allowing commanders to identify weak points in German defenses and position forces for maximum effectiveness with minimum casualties. When word filtered through command channels about the unconventional capture method, reactions split between admiration for results and skepticism about replicability. Some officers saw it as a one-time lucky success, circumstances aligning perfectly to produce results that couldn't be consistently repeated. Others recognized that Chin had identified a genuine capability gap and developed a field-expedient solution that addressed it. The debate might have remained academic, except that 2 weeks later, another reconnaissance patrol used Chen's technique to capture 7 German soldiers, and a week after that, a British commando unit modified the approach to capture 12 during a night raid, and suddenly Rust wire traps became something intelligence officers specifically requested when planning operations requiring prisoner captures. Chin found himself pulled from regular patrol duty to conduct training sessions, teaching other reconnaissance soldiers the theory and practice of entanglement traps, explaining the psychology of disorientation, and how to exploit those critical seconds when targets were confused and vulnerable. His Rust wire method evolved through these training sessions, incorporating refinements suggested by other soldiers, adapting to different terrain types and tactical situations, gradually transforming from one corporal's improvised idea into a documented technique that appeared in classified field manuals distributed to Allied Special Operations units. The official designation was Expedient Entanglement Capture System, which was typical military bureaucracy, turning something practical into something that sounded impressive in reports, but soldiers continued calling them chun traps or rust wire captures, nicknames that acknowledged the origin even as the technique spread beyond its inventor's control. By December 1944, variations of Chen's method had been used successfully in over 40 operations across the European theater, capturing more than 200 enemy soldiers with remarkably low casualty rates compared to traditional combat-based prisoner-taking. German intelligence noted with confusion that Allied forces had developed new capture techniques, reporting to their high command that American and British patrols were somehow restraining German soldiers without sustained firefights, suggesting new equipment or tactics they couldn't identify. In reality, it was just wire and geometry and understanding human psychology well enough to exploit the moment of confusion. After the war, Chin returned to San Francisco and his family's import business, never discussing his military service in detail beyond acknowledging he'd served in Europe. The Official Secrets Act initially classified his capture technique, though it was gradually declassified to the 1950s as the specific tactical innovations of World War II became historical rather than operational information. By the time military historians began serious study of reconnaissance tactics in the 1960s, Chen's contribution had been absorbed into the general body of special operations doctrine, referenced in technical manuals without much attention to origin or inventor. A few dedicated researchers tracked down the original after-action reports and identified Chun as the originator, but their findings appeared in specialist military journals that general audiences never read. Chun himself seemed content with obscurity, building a successful business, raising a family, occasionally attending veterans' reunions where old reconnaissance soldiers would recognize him and share stories about the time someone tried a chun trap in Italy or modified the approach for jungle operations in the Pacific. He died in 1998. His obituary mentioning military service without specific details, another veteran whose particular contribution to history was known to a small circle of specialists but invisible to broader public awareness. His rust wire trap, however, lived on in unexpected ways. Modern military training includes sections on improvised restraint systems, teaching soldiers how to use available materials for prisoner control in situations where standard equipment isn't available. The psychological principles Chun intuited, a about exploiting disorientation and confusion to multiply effective force, became foundational concepts in close-quarters combat doctrine and hostage rescue techniques. Law enforcement agencies adapted variations for crowd control and less lethal detention methods. The elegant simplicity of using environment and psychology rather than overwhelming force to achieve objectives influenced tactical thinking across multiple domains, all tracing lineage back to a corporal who collected rusty wire and thought carefully about geometry and human behavior. The story of Chen's rust wire trap illuminates important truths about military innovation that formal histories often miss. Revolutionary advances don't always come from research laboratories or senior strategists with comprehensive understanding of doctrine and capability. Sometimes they come from junior soldiers facing practical problems without adequate solutions, people who combine technical knowledge with creativity and willingness to try unconventional approaches despite institutional skepticism. Chen succeeded because he understood materials and mechanics from a civilian background, because combat experience taught him enemy behavior patterns, and because he had the intellectual confidence to trust his own analysis even when it contradicted established procedures. His success also required Morrison's willingness to support an unconventional idea despite personal skepticism, and intelligence officers' wisdom to recognize valuable results regardless of unorthodox methods. Military institutions simultaneously need discipline and flexibility, standardization and innovation, and the challenge is creating cultures that maintain necessary control while allowing individuals to contribute creative solutions. Chen's rust wire trap worked because it addressed a specific gap in reconnaissance capabilities, the lack of effective methods for small patrols to capture enemy soldiers without combat. It succeeded because the solution was elegantly simple, using available materials and requiring no special equipment or extensive training beyond understanding the basic principles. Most importantly, it succeeded because Chen was willing to take personal risk, both physical in implementing the trap and professional in proposing something that might have gotten him punished for exceeding authority if it had failed. That combination of technical insight, practical implementation, and moral courage defined his achievement. The trap itself was clever but not revolutionary, the kind of thing that in retrospect seems obvious, making people wonder why no one thought of it earlier. The answer is that someone did think of it, thought carefully and deeply enough to turn the idea into practical reality, and had circumstances aligned to provide opportunity for proof. Chen's legacy isn't primarily the specific technique he invented, though that was significant, but rather the demonstration that individual soldiers thinking creatively about problems can develop solutions that reshape doctrine and save lives. His story challenges a narrative that military innovation flows top-down from institutional leadership, showing instead that valuable advances often emerge bottom-up from practitioners who understand operational problems intimately and have freedom to experiment with solutions. Modern military organizations study historical cases like Chen's trying to understand how to systematically encourage such innovation while maintaining necessary discipline, how to identify and support creative thinkers without creating chaos, how to rapidly evaluate and adopt successful field expedients without compromising standardization. There are no perfect answers, but Chen's experience suggests some principles. Listen to junior soldiers who propose unconventional ideas, evaluate proposals based on practical merit rather than conformity to doctrine, allow controlled experimentation under appropriate supervision, and rapidly disseminate successful innovations across the force. Most fundamentally, his story reminds us that warfare, despite all its technology and doctrine and institutional structure, ultimately comes down to individuals making decisions under pressure, and sometimes the person who makes the crucial difference is someone history would otherwise forget. A quiet corporal who collected rusty wire and understood that geometry and psychology could multiply force effectiveness in ways that firepower alone could not achieve.